January 1945. Vogelsang Airfield, southern Germany. The pre-dawn cold bites through wool and leather. A young Luftwaffe pilot, barely 22, his Iron Cross still gleaming against a threadbare tunic, watches the eastern horizon bleed pale orange through the frost on his cockpit canopy. He climbs into his Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Its twin Jumo engines promising speeds no Allied piston aircraft can match. The engine whine is sharp, alien, a sound from tomorrow. He believes this machine will save the Reich. He believes in the invincibility written into its swept wings and its 430mm cannons. He believes because he must. 6,000 miles away in a guarded hangar at Muroc Army Airfield in California's Mojave Desert, another pilot straps into a machine that doesn't officially exist. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star sits low and predatory, its lines clean where the Me-262s are brutal, its single engine buried deep in the fuselage. That engine, the General Electric I-40, later designated the J-33, hums with a different kind of promise. Not desperation, not ideology, just raw, uncompromising American industrial power born from a design the British had deemed inadequate. A cast-off that crossed the Atlantic in disgrace, only to be reborn in the hands of engineers who saw not failure but possibility. This is not a story about aerial combat alone. This is a story about rejection and resurrection, about how a spurned piece of machinery became the instrument that would carry American pilots into a new age of warfare, and how the men who flew it discovered that speed, not just of the aircraft but of innovation, production, and adaptation, would decide who wrote the ending of the war and the beginning of what came after. The jet engine itself was never supposed to be American. Britain's Frank Whittle had spent the 1930s begging his government for funding, dismissed by committees who saw no practical application for a turbine that consumed fuel like a bonfire and produced thrust measured in increments too small to matter. While Whittle persisted in obscurity, Germany's Hans von Ohain independently developed his own design, and by August 1939, the Heinkel He-178 screamed over Rostock Marine as the world's first jet-powered aircraft. The British scrambled to catch up. The Americans, still committed to piston supremacy and the liquid-cooled Allisons and Packards that powered their Mustangs and Lightnings, barely noticed. But war compresses time. By 1941, Britain was bleeding pilots and burning through aircraft faster than factories could replace them. The Air Ministry, desperate for any advantage, greenlit Whittle's Powerjet's W2 design for production. Yet Whittle's engine, for all its theoretical elegance, carried fatal flaws for military application. It was fragile. Its centrifugal compressor, while simpler than axial designs, limited performance ceilings. Its fuel consumption made range calculations a cruel joke. British manufacturers, already stretched thin building Spitfires and Lancasters, looked at the W2 and saw not a war winner, but a resource trap. Enter General Electric. In October 1941, under conditions of absolute secrecy, a Whittle W1X engine was crated and shipped across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to a GE facility in Lynn, Massachusetts. The British government attached a simple message: study it, improve it, build it, we cannot. American engineers, men who had spent careers making locomotives and power turbines, tore the W1X apart and found a machine that violated every principle of American mass production. Hand-fitted parts, tolerances measured by craftsmen with calipers and intuition, metallurgy that required alloys not yet in the American supply chain. The British had built an art object. GE needed to build a weapon, they did. Within months, GE's IA engine, a reverse-engineered Americanized W2B, roared to life on test stands. It was cruder than Whittle's original, heavier, less efficient, but it could be built by machinists who had never seen a turbine blade, assembled in factories tooled for quantity, not precision. The IA became the I-16, then the I-40, each iteration shedding European refinement and gaining American pragmatism. Thrust climbed. Weight dropped. Reliability, measured not in hours but in combat sorties, became the metric that mattered. Yet even as GE refined the engine, the British rejected it. The Royal Air Force's Gloucester Meteor, Britain's answer to the Me-262, flew with Rolls-Royce Welland engines derived from Whittle's later W2B-23 design. The Air Ministry deemed the American modifications too radical, too unproven. The I-40 in British eyes was a step backward, a brute force solution lacking the elegance of proper engineering. The engine that would power America's first jet fighter was, to its originators, a failure of imagination. But the Americans were not building for elegance. They were building for war. In June 1943, the Army Air Forces issued a specification for a jet fighter capable of exceeding 500 miles per hour, with enough range to escort bombers and enough armament to kill. Lockheed aircraft, already legendary for the P-38 Lightning, received the contract with a deadline that made engineers laugh until they realized it wasn't a joke: 180 days from contract to first flight. Clarence Kelly Johnson, Lockheed's chief engineer and the man who would later create the U-2 and SR-71, assembled a team in a rented circus tent next to the Burbank airport. They called it the Skunk Works after a moonshine factory in the Lil Abner comic strip. The name stuck. Johnson's design philosophy was brutal simplicity. The XP-80, as the prototype was designated, would be built around the engine, not the other way around. The I-40 would sit in the fuselage center, fed by intake ducts in the wing roots exhausting beneath the tail. 650 caliber machine guns, proven, reliable, deadly, clustered in the nose. Tricycle landing gear for easy ground handling. Thin straight wings optimized for high subsonic speed. Nothing experimental. Nothing unproven. Just physics and steel and the assumption that American factories could build anything if you made the blueprint simple enough. On January 8, 1944, 143 days after the contract was signed, test pilot Milo Burcham lifted XP-80 Lulu Bell off the Muroc lakebed and climbed into history. The jet age for America had begun. But speed on a test range is not the same as speed in combat. And combat in early 1945 was where the Me-262 was proving that jet propulsion changed every rule. The Messerschmitt appeared over Germany in July 1944, and Allied pilots who encountered it reported the impossible. A fighter that could climb through bomber formations at speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, fire a burst from cannons that could shred a B-17, then dive away before escorts could react. P-51 Mustangs, the pride of the 8th Air Force, could barely touch 440 miles per hour in level flight. The Me-262 could run circles around them, literally. Luftwaffe pilots, bloodied and exhausted after years of attrition, suddenly had a weapon that restored the advantage they'd lost when American Mustangs began escorting bombers to Berlin and back. But the Me-262 was a weapon born of desperation, and desperation is a poor architect. Its Junkers Jumo 04 engines required overhauls every 10 hours of flight time. The turbine blades, made from low-grade steel because Germany's chrome and nickel supplies had been bombed into rubble, disintegrated under heat and stress. Pilots were trained to nurse the throttles to never advance power too quickly, or the compressor would stall and the engine would flame out. On takeoff and landing, when the aircraft was slow, vulnerable, Allied fighters learned to loiter and pounce. The Me-262 was fast, but it was not reliable, and in war, reliability kills more enemies than speed ever will. The P-80, by contrast, was designed with American logistics in mind. The I-40 engine could run for 40 hours between major maintenance. Its turbine blades, made from American nickel-chromium alloys, could sustain temperatures and stresses that would melt German steel. Ground crews could swap an engine in under 4 hours using standard tools and manuals written in plain English, not engineering jargon. The P-80 wasn't faster than the Me-262. Its top speed was 520 miles per hour, 30 less than the German jet, but it could fly more sorties, stay airborne longer, and return to base without cannibalizing parts from other aircraft. This was the American way of war. Not individual brilliance, but systemic excellence. Not the best machine, but the best machine that could be built 1,000 times over. Yet the P-80 arrived too late for Europe. The first operational shooting stars didn't reach Italy until March 1945, weeks before Germany's collapse. They flew reconnaissance missions, feeling out jet operations, but never encountered the Me-262 in combat. The war ended before the two machines could test each other's doctrines in the only arena that mattered. But the pilots knew. They knew in the way the P-80 accelerated, smooth and relentless without the shudder and scream of a piston engine clawing for speed. They knew in the silence, and the men who flew it were different too. Lieutenant Colonel William Council, one of the first P-80 pilots, described the transition in his after-action reports. In a piston fighter, you manage the engine. You lean the mixture, adjust the prop pitch, monitor temperatures and pressures. You're a mechanic as much as a pilot. In the P-80, you manage energy. The engine responds to one input, throttle. Everything else is about speed and altitude and angles. It's pure, unforgiving. You think faster because you're moving faster. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived their Me-262s said something similar, but their words carried a different weight. Lieutenant Friedrich Stahle, who flew with Jagdverband 44, the elite jet unit commanded by Adolf Galland, wrote after the war, "We were gods for 30 minutes, and then we were targets." The jets gave us speed, but they took time. Time to start, time to climb, time we no longer had. The Americans had time. They had fuel. They had engines that didn't burn out. We had desperation wearing a jet engine. This is the story the machines tell. The Me-262 was a brilliant improvisation, a gamble that almost paid off. The P-80 was not brilliant. It was inevitable. It was the product of a nation that could afford to reject a British engine, rebuild it from scratch, and field a fighter built around it before the original designers had solved their own problems. It was the product of factories in Lynn and Schenectady and Burbank that could retool in months and produce in quantity. It was the product of a logistics system that could ship engines across oceans, train pilots in deserts, and still have enough of everything left over to do it again tomorrow. But there is a deeper story here, one that transcends throttles and turbines. The American pilot in the P-80 and the German pilot in the Me-262 were separated by more than nationality. They were separated by the philosophies that built their machines. The Me-262 was a product of genius constrained by scarcity, brilliant engineers forced to make compromises that killed pilots. The P-80 was a product of competence unleashed by abundance, good engineers given the resources to iterate, test, fail, and rebuild until they got it right. This abundance was not just material. It was intellectual. American engineers could afford to reject Whittle's elegant design because they knew they had the capacity to create something different, something better suited to their strengths. British and German engineers, working within systems that punished failure and rewarded conformity, could not. The GEI-40 was rejected by the British not because it was worse, but because it was different. And difference required resources Britain no longer had. The P-80 pilots felt this abundance every time they strapped in. They flew with the knowledge that if they bent the landing gear on a rough field, another aircraft would arrive within days. If an engine flamed out over enemy territory, a search and rescue operation, coordinated by radio nets and supported by reserves held back for exactly this contingency, would come looking. They fought with the confidence that comes from knowing the system behind you is not just functional, but excessive, wasteful even, throwing resources at problems until the problems disappear. The Luftwaffe pilots felt the opposite. They flew knowing that every sortie might be their last, not because of enemy fire, but because the engine might quit, the fuel might run out, the runway might be cratered by bombing raids, the replacement parts might never arrive. They fought with the desperation of men who understood that brilliance, courage, and skill could not overcome arithmetic. They were outnumbered, outproduced, and outlasted. The Me-262 was supposed to change that equation. It didn't. It couldn't. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The Me-262, once the Luftwaffe's last hope, became a trophy. American engineers swarmed over captured examples, measuring, photographing, dissecting. They found brilliance in the design, the swept wings that delayed compressibility effects, the placement of engines in underwing nacelles for easy maintenance. But they also found the scars of scarcity. Hand-filed parts, welds that wouldn't pass inspection in an American factory, metallurgy that sacrificed longevity for immediate performance. The P-80, by contrast, transitioned seamlessly from prototype to production. Lockheed delivered over 1,700 Shooting Stars before the end of 1946. They equipped training squadrons, air defense wings, tactical units. They became the foundation of the U.S. Air Force's jet transition program, the aircraft that taught a generation of pilots how to think in terms of energy management and transonic flight regimes. They served in Korea, outmatched by the MiG-15 but still deadly in ground attack roles, still reliable, still doing the job they were built for. But the true legacy of the P-80, and the rejected engine that powered it, was not in the aircraft itself. It was in the philosophy it represented. The GEI-40 became the J-33, which became the foundation for the J-47, the engine that powered the F-86 Sabre, the fighter that would dominate Korean skies and prove that American jets could match Soviet designs built with German data and British theory. The J-47 became the most produced jet engine in history, with over 35,000 units built. It powered bombers and fighters and trainers, a single design adapted and refined and mass-produced until it became ubiquitous. This was the lesson of the P-80. Not that American engineering was superior, but that American systems, the industrial base, the logistics network, the willingness to iterate and improve rather than perfect and deploy, could turn a rejected British engine into the foundation of air dominance for a generation. The German pilot in his Me-262, watching the horizon burn orange in January 1945, could not have known this. He could not have known that the war was already lost, that the jet he flew was a technological marvel rendered strategically irrelevant by the weight of Allied production. He could not have known that across the Atlantic, in a desert he'd never seen, another pilot was strapping into a machine that would define the future he would not live to see. But perhaps he felt it. Perhaps in the moments before he advanced the throttles and felt the Jumo engines spool up, he felt the weight of fighting for a cause that had run out of everything except ideology. Perhaps he understood that speed alone could not save him, that all the engineering genius in the world could not overcome the simple, brutal fact that his enemy had more of everything, more fuel, more pilots, more engines, more time. The American pilot in the P-80 felt something different. He felt the hum of an engine built not by craftsmen but by assembly lines, an engine that was good enough, reliable enough, powerful enough. He felt the solidity of a system that would not let him fail for lack of resources. He felt the weight of responsibility that comes with abundance. The knowledge that he was not fighting to survive but to end the fight, to impose a future shaped by the values that built the machine beneath him. This is what the rejected engine represents. Not just thrust and turbine blades and fuel consumption curves, but a worldview. The belief that problems can be solved by application of resources, that failure is not fatal but informational, that the best solution is the one that works reliably at scale, not the one that achieves theoretical perfection in limited trials. The GEI-40 was rejected because it was not perfect. It became legendary because it was good enough, in quantities large enough soon enough to matter. In the end, the P-80 and Me-262 never truly fought each other. History robbed them of that confrontation. But the contest between the philosophies they embodied, scarcity versus abundance, genius versus system, desperation versus confidence, played out across every theater of World War II and every conflict that followed. The Luftwaffe pilot in his Me-262 was flying a monument to what could have been, if only. The American pilot in his P-80 was flying a promise of what would be, inevitably. One was faster on paper. The other built the world that came after. And when the war ended and the engineers gathered to write the history of jet propulsion, they did not remember the rejection. They remembered the resurrection. They remembered that a British engine deemed inadequate by its creators became, in American hands, the instrument that carried jet aviation from theory to dominance in less than 5 years. The young Luftwaffe pilot did not survive the war. His name is lost to records that burned in the chaos of collapse. But his Me-262, captured intact, sits in a museum now, its swept wings and predatory lines a testament to brilliance constrained by circumstance. The American pilot who flew the P-80 over Muroc that January morning in 1945 went on to fly Sabres in Korea, to train the next generation of jet pilots, to watch as the children of the I-40 engine-powered aircraft that broke the sound barrier reached the edge of space and redrew the boundaries of what was possible. He flew, knowing what the German pilot could never know, that the machine beneath him was not a last gamble, but a first step, not an ending but a beginning, not reject, and the war, already decided by factories and logistics and the weight of accumulated advantages, finds its symbol in the rejected engine that refused to stay rejected, in the pilots who flew it not to survive but to prevail, in the roar of turbines that drowned out the ideologies of scarcity and sang instead the song of a nation that could afford to build tomorrow while still winning today.